Good evening and welcome to all of you here in the room and those of you who are watching this on Zoom. My name is Melinda Gellman, and I am a faculty member of the New York University Postdoctoral Program in Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis. We are delighted to be collaborating tonight with our colleagues from the Freud Museum and in Vienna and from the Freud Foundation, US. Together, we welcome Mark Solms, who will tell us about the highly anticipated revised standard edition of Freud. Dr. Solms has edited and expanded these 24 volumes over the last, I think, 30 years, with new original material, new translations, and much, much scholarship. First, I will say to our guests here a few words about the New York University postdoctoral program. NYU postdoc set its roots within a university and began training its first class of psychoanalytic candidates in 1961. This year is not quite in the center of the 21-year period from 1953 to 1974, across which Strachey's original 24 volumes of the standard edition were published. NYU Postdoc was founded on the then radical premises that there is more than a single and static way to think about psychoanalytic theory, and that a humanistic psychoanalysis might help a wide range of patients to suffer less. Over subsequent decades, and with some struggles that many believe are part of our strength, our curriculum remains responsive to new and divergent ideas. We've maintained pride in an identity that is open to intellectual evolution, innovation, and integration in the field of psychoanalysis. So it is in that spirit that we are particularly excited to welcome Mark Solms and eager to hear about his enormous achievement that brings us the revised standard edition. I will now invite some welcome remarks from Monika Pessler, who is the director of the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, and from Tom Kohut, president of the Freud Foundation US. I will then briefly introduce Dr. Solms, and after his talk, there will be time for questions from the audience. Thank you. Monika?
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And I also would like to thank the New York University program, postdoc program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, Spiros Orphanos and Melinda Gellman, and the Freud Foundation US for organizing this, I think, extraordinary event. As the director of the Sigmund Freud Museum, I'm particularly pleased because our gathering today reflects also the core of our motivation and work at the origin of psychoanalysis in Vienna, where Freud explored the unconscious mind, opening a new perspective on humanity at the turn of the last century. Therefore, our foremost museum's mission is to activate Freud's legacy for the current discourse, because we are more convinced than ever that psychoanalysis offers still important and meaningful tools for addressing the problems of our times, and thus allow us to gain a better understanding of the current processes in our societies and also their conflictual developments. The renowned psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and author Mark Solms has been contributing to this interest in Freud's legacy since decades. In 2007, he held a Freud lecture at Berggasse 19, entitled Freud's Dream Theory Today, and especially his new revised standard edition of Sigmund Freud's writings last year An updated translation will provide a deep understanding, I'm sure, of Freud's psychoanalytic theories worldwide, and in this respect, also paved the way for its contemporary interpretation and use. Thank you very much.
Hi, so thanks, Moni, thanks, Melinda, and also thanks to Spiros Orfanos in absentia, because he did a great deal to help make this event possible, as did Melinda. I'm here to join in welcoming you to this evening's lecture in my capacity as president of the Freud Foundation US. And the Freud Foundation US, the Freud Foundation is a US-based organization that supports the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, and in conjunction with the museum, sponsors events like tonight's lecture by Mark Solms. In keeping with the spirit of the museum, we work to bring Freud, and perhaps even more, what you might call the Freudian spirit of courageous, depth psychological inquiry, to bear on the important, troubling, and perplexing challenges we face in our 21st century world. In addition to tonight's lecture, we have sponsored an ongoing clinical case conference for over 3 years with Ukrainian psychotherapists doing therapy under conditions of war. Together with the Erickson Institute of the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, we in the museum brought an exhibition to Stockbridge on the flight of Viennese psychoanalysts from Nazi Austria, originally shown at the museum in Vienna, and put on a series of virtual panels on the impact of those refugees on American psychoanalysis. Along with the museum and the Erickson Institute, we are currently well along in planning 3 events on the psychological importance of place. One to be held at the Freud Museum in Vienna, one at the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York, whose director, Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger, is here with us this evening, and one at Austin Riggs in Stockbridge. We will be sending all of you an email with information about our programming, a link to our website, and an invitation to become a friend of the Freud Museum through the Freud Foundation US. The idea of inviting Mark to deliver this evening's lecture about the new translation of Freud came from a member of our foundation board, Eric Bettelheim. Not only is Eric, like Mark, a neuroscientist, but Eric's father, Bruno Bettelheim, in 1983 published the book Freud and Man's Soul, which called attention to the deficiencies of the Strachey translation of Freud's collected works, a translation that, in Bettelheim's view, rendered Freud less humanistic and less humane than he, in fact, was. I think, Mark, you will be talking a bit about this, so I'm looking forward to hearing. I'm looking, that's good. That's never happened before. That's very interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing Mark speak about his newly translated edition of Freud this evening.
Thank you, Monika. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for informing us about your organizations. It's good to hear. And thank you for all the wonderful programming, much of which is made available to the international learning community. So that's great. So now we're going to hear from Mark Solms, the man whose life's work began by turning his keen scientific mind and his keen interest in lived human experience to dreaming. His early neuropsychological research led to discovering the brain mechanisms of dreams, which he then brought into dialogue with Freudian dream theory. Many of you here tonight are already familiar with the scope of his long-standing contributions and his dedication to building bridges between the disciplines of neuroscience and psychoanalysis in light of advancing technologies and clinical data. For those less familiar, Dr. Solms is credited for coining the term neuropsychoanalysis. In the year 2000, he founded the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society, which is hosting its 24th annual Congress here in New York over the next days. And he was co-founder in 1999 of the journal Neuropsychoanalysis. Dr. Solms has published 350 scientific papers and 8 books, the latest entitled The Hidden Spring, a journey to the source of consciousness, in which he addresses the centrality of emotion and affect to human nature and consciousness. His numerous honors include the Sigourney Award, the most prestigious award for contributions to psychoanalysis. He is an esteemed member of the British Psychoanalytic Society and the American Psychoanalytic and South African Psychoanalytic Associations. He is director of neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town and an honorary fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists. Mr. Mark Solms addresses us tonight as the authorized editor and translator of the Revised Standard Edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud. So without further ado, thank you, Mark Solms, for your dreams, for your strong seeking drive, and for your persistent curiosity that has benefited us all.
Thank you very much. Thanks all for being here. Let me just try and align this thing with me. So I'm going to speak for the typical 50-minute hour. So I'm going to start, and this is going to be the main focus of what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to start by talking about Strachey's translations. James Strachey was, of course, my predecessor. He was the editor of the standard edition of Freud's complete psychological works, which were published in the 50s and 60s. The last volume came out after his death in 1974. So when I was appointed, embarrassingly 30 years ago, it took me a full 29 years to do this thing. When I was appointed in 1995, this was the single biggest question that I faced. As you heard with reference to Bruno Bettelheim's book, there was a great deal of criticism of Strachey's translation. And the question that I faced was, do I start all over again? Do I replace Strachey's translation with a new one? Or do I retain Strachey's translation, and in particular his technical vocabulary, because that's what the great controversy was about. And I'm going to show you or explain to you why I made the decision that I did, and then the rest of it will be detail. So in his preface to the first volume of the standard edition, Strachey writes this. He says that in doing the translation, he's imagining that these are the writings of some English man of science of wide education born in the middle of the 19th century. Please note, Freud was not an English man of science. This is what translation's all about. So in reimagining Freud as an Englishman, Strachey was making a particular choice, a choice that faces every translator. You either privilege or prioritize the conventions, the linguistic conventions of the source language, the language you're translating from, in this case German, or you prioritize those of the target language, the language you're translating into. And either way, something is lost. Something's always lost in translation. If you take if you prioritize the source language, it's more literal, the translation is. It's closer to what was originally written by the author you're translating, but it reads sort of clumsily in the target language. So what's gained is it's accurate, it's close, it's as close as possible to what the author actually wrote. But what's lost is style and Englishness in this case. So I don't think anybody could fairly blame Strachey for choosing the second approach because, as I say, either way you lose something. He imagined Freud as an Englishman. So this is not what the controversy was about. Bizarrely, the controversy was about Freud as a man of science? Why did Strachey imagine Freud as an English man of science? As you heard in the introduction, some people, Bruno Bettelheim, no less than him, and many others, in criticizing Strachey's translation, they said that he's made Freud look like a scientist. He's made Freud sound much more scientific than he does in the German. And this is actually the main complaint. So as I read through all of this secondary literature, all of this criticism of of Strachey's translation of Freud, this was the nub of the matter. This is what I had to grapple with. Had Strachey falsely scientized Freud? And here's the quotation by Jean Laplanche, who was my equivalent in French. He was the editor of the French translation of Freud's complete psychological works. And this statement, this bold statement by Laplanche that Strachey falsely scientized Freud is really the red thread that runs through all the criticism of Strachey's translation. That was Bruno Bettelheim's criticism, as I say. It's certainly Adam Phillips's criticism. It's Patrick Mahoney's criticism, Darius Ornsten's criticism. These are all the main commentators on Strachey's translation. So I'm going to be addressing this question with you this evening. Did Strachey falsely scientize Freud? The first problem with this claim is this is what Freud wrote about himself. He imagined himself not as an English man of science, but he certainly imagined himself as a man of science. He said psychoanalysis too is a natural science, a Naturwissenschaft, a natural science. What else can it be? So for Freud, this was not even a question whether psychoanalysis is science. Certainly, I think it is debatable how much Freud achieved in terms of his goal of establishing a natural science of the mind, but that was his goal. He saw himself as doing science. So how can we falsely scientize a person like this? Well, I'll tell you. Here is a really minimalist selection of many technical terms that have led to this criticism. In the left-hand column, you have the German terms, Freud's terms. In the right-hand column, you have Strachey's translations of those terms. And in the middle column, you have what the words actually mean. So Anlernung, which is something I'm going to come back to later, which means something like leaning on or leaning onness. Strachey translates anaklesis from the ancient Greek, from the very ancient Greek. Besetzung, which means occupation in the sense that Russia has occupied part of Ukraine. That's what a Besetzung is. Or if you're in the lavatory and, you slide the little lock and it says occupied. In Germany and Austria, it says besetzt. This is occupied. No German speaker could be any doubt as to what Besetzung means. But Strachey translated it cathexis. And unless you've been deeply educated in the arcane terminology of Strachey, nobody knows what the hell cathexis means. Einfühlung, again, any German speaker will know this means feeling into. It's literally what it means. Strachey translated empathy. Now, empathy is a word that you do all know, but at the time that Strachey first used it, it wasn't well known. It was a really experienced, distant, technical term recently introduced into experimental psychology. Das Ich is probably the most obvious. I mean, it means I. It can't possibly mean anything other than I. I mean, everyone knows what I means. It means me. This is what I identify myself as being. My Ich, that's very clear what it is to a German speaker. But your ego, I mean, I'm not a Latin ego. And das Es, again, the it, that's what it means. And you speak of children as it, it's troublesome things that you don't feel yourself to be. Strachey, again, had recourse to Latin and called it the id. And one of my favorites is Schaulust, which means either desire to look or pleasure in looking. Strachey translated it as scopophilia, which sounds like a dreadful disease. So why did he do all of this? This is what the problem is all about. Now, actually, as you heard in the introductions, I'm a neuroscientist. That's my primary profession before I trained in psychoanalysis. And oddly enough, the way I came to be appointed as the editor of the Revised Standard Edition of Freud's psychological works is that I was already busy translating Freud's neuroscientific works in 4 volumes. That's what I actually wanted to do in the first instance. And then I had this minor detour, minor distraction for 29 years to do his psychological works. And it's only now that I'm finally getting back to doing what I had started out with in the first place. And so let me look at this from a neuroscientific point of view, if you will allow me to. And I beg you to allow me to, because Freud was, first and foremost, like me, before he became a psychoanalyst, he was a neuroscientist. His first field was neuroanatomy. So here are some neuroanatomical technical terms. There's a thing called das Balken. I'll show it to you. I don't have a pointer. I wonder if maybe I can get a pointer. Yeah, I can. Laser pointer there. So this is das Balken. It is a beam of fibers that joins the 2 hemispheres together. And that's why it's called the beam in German anatomy. I'm okay with this, thanks, because the people on Zoom. Yeah, thanks, Richard. But look at what we call it in English anatomy. We call it the corpus callosum, from the Latin. Now, if you look at this beam, you'll see that at the front of it, there's a bend which looks rather like a knee, a lateral view of a knee, which is why in German anatomy, it's called das Knie des Balkens, the knee of the beam. But in English anatomy, we call it the genu of the corpus callosum. There's another structure, which I'll show you in a second, called the Brücke, which means nothing other than the bridge. And it refers to a beam of fibers that wraps around the brain stem. But in English neuroanatomy, we don't call it the bridge, we call it the pons. This is a very nice one. The 4 hills in German. In English, we call the corpora quadrigemina. So here is that bridge, and there are the 4 hills. Well, you only see 2 of them here. My favorite when it comes to the neuroanatomical terms is there's a little structure hanging off the back of the brain stem over here, and above it is a big structure over there. In German, this little structure is called the Kleinhirn, the little brain. And in German, this part is called the Großhirn, the big brain, or the great brain. In English neuroanatomy, this is called the cerebellum, and this is called the cerebrum. So exactly the same thing as happened to Freud's technical vocabulary in his psychological writings in the translation, happened also to all technical neuroanatomical terms for centuries. Now, you might think I'm biased because I'm a neuroscientist. You might think I'm cherry-picking this little discipline in order to make an argument. So let me go to a discipline that perhaps will be more familiar to you, namely chemistry. In German chemistry, there's a substance called Wasserstoff, which means nothing other than water stuff. And what do we call it in English? We call it hydrogen. And there's Sauerstoff, sour stuff, which in English chemistry we call oxygen. So remember, I said Strachey imagined Freud as an English man of science. So he prioritized conventions of English. And in English science, this is what you do. You translate technical terms using neologisms from Latin and Greek. Why do we do this? Well, first of all, it's conventional. So Strachey was following the conventions of English And as I said, nobody can blame him for that, because either way, you prioritize either the German conventions or the English ones, and you lose something either way. He went for the English conventions, and so he used Latin and Greek. The question as to why this was done was because the aim was to have an international language of science, a language of science that could, the technical terminology of which could be recognized everywhere. Only in German do we not use that technical, well, we do use it, but we also use this everyday ordinary German. Here's Ernest Jones. I was going to say pontificating about it. He says, Germany, of all the civilized countries, is the only one that eschews the international vocabulary, a fact that has called for much spleen among the foreign readers of that language. Now, I don't know why in German it is so common to do this thing that is so uncommon in every other language, and certainly in English science, but I suspect it's got something to do with Luther. You know, Luther wanted to give the Bible, you know, in echt Deutsch, that every German speaker could understand, and not this Roman Catholic Latin nonsense. You know, I suspect that's where it came from. But in any event, that's what happened. And so I don't think, on consideration of all of this very closely, I don't think that it's fair to say that what Strachey did was a false scientization of Freud. Freud saw himself as a scientist. He was trying to write as a scientist. He was trying to bring the lived life of the mind, which is certainly part of nature. He was trying to bring that into science. And he used the kinds of terms that are normal in German science. That is a slightly extended version of ordinary everyday German terms. But in English science, it would be frankly silly for me to translate Freud's Besetzung as occupation, or his Einfühlung as feeling into-ness. It just sounds odd in English. It doesn't sound scientific at all. It would be as silly as translating, if Freud were a chemist, if I were to translate him using the term Wasserstoff, you know, as water stuff. It would make Freud a laughingstock. And Freud really did want to be taken seriously as a scientist. And Strachey and Jones, especially Jones, because Jones was Strachey's superego. Jones had a committee that advised Strachey on how he should translate these technical terms. And Jones was very keen that Freud and psychoanalysis should be taken seriously in English medicine and English science. Now, I said I'm going to come back to this term anaclysis. This is what Laplanche said about anaclysis. Anaclysis is Anlernung, that leaning onness, leaning uponness, something like that. Propping might be a word. Laplanche says that anaclysis, Strachey's choice, is a barbaric and lifeless term. So let me tell you something interesting about this term. I told you I started out translating Freud's neuroscientific works, and here's one of Freud's very first neuroscientific works. He was tracing the passage of nerve fibers in the spinal nerve root, the dorsal root of a very lowly fish known as the lamprey. And here's the root coming, here it is, and this is Freud's own drawings of each one of the neurons. They didn't even know yet that these things are neurons. Here is the cell body, there is the fiber, and it carries on the other side. In tracing these fibers, Freud noticed that not all of them have their origin in the gray matter of that segment of the cord that forms that nerve root. Some of them have their cell bodies higher up in the spinal cord, and so it's just a fiber that leans upon the actual nerve root fibers. It just follows the same, sort of piggybacks on the root. And guess what Freud called those fibers? He called them angelernte Fasern, leaning on fibers. And when I translated this, which was before I immersed myself in the controversy about Strachey, because at that time I hadn't yet been asked to do the psychological works, it would have been truly ridiculous if I had translated these as leaning on fibers. It wouldn't sound like proper anatomy. So I realized, oh, Strachey had coined this nifty term, anaclysis for Anlehnung. So I translated these angelernte Fasern as anaclitic fibers, which sounds like proper anatomy. And so if I hadn't done that, and I've already said if I hadn't done that, it would sound silly. But the fact that I did do that seems perfectly normal. But if I didn't do the same in the psychological works, it would be a really big decision. It would be saying Freud was doing science when he was doing this neuroanatomy, and therefore I use one word there. But when it came to psychoanalysis, he wasn't doing science anymore. So now I don't use scientific convention, even though Freud thought he was doing science. And you see where I'm going with this. And in any event, if I changed it, you would lose a very interesting continuity. Because certainly this continuity would have existed in Freud's mind. He was proud of this discovery of these angelernte Fasern, he named them. And so that continuity was there for him, as indeed would have been for the word Besetzung, which was frequently used in the neurophysiology of his time, as was, by the way, the term Das Ich. This is not a term invented by Freud. It's a term that has a long and venerable history in philosophy. And guess how it's translated in 19th and 18th century English translations of the German philosophers in question? It's translated as the ego. It's conventional, even in philosophy. So my decision was, I'm going to retain Strachey's technical vocabulary. I have to say that was the main reason that I chose to retain it. But it wasn't the only reason. There were other reasons, not least of them being the fact that it was now conventional. Those terms are conventional in psychoanalysis. Everyone is familiar now in psychoanalysis with these words. And to change them at this point, 125 years into the history of our field, it would be really strange. It would take an enormous amount for us to all get used to a whole new technical vocabulary. And in any event, as I say, I don't think the new vocabulary would be justified. So I decided to retain Strachey's technical terminology, and only to change his translations where he made errors. Errors? Yes, he made many errors. Errors are not points of controversy about how should you have translated this. They're errors. Like what? Well, like leaving out a sentence, which Strachey did more than once. Strachey was elderly, and Strachey was really quite visually impaired by the time that he did the standard edition. And frankly, after my 29 years of working in his footsteps, the same is happening to me. So, he has my every sympathy. But he frequently left sentences out, misread words, that sort of thing. That's what I'm talking about when I say I've corrected errors. But when it comes to his technical the translation of technical terms, this is the only technical terminological translation that I think qualifies as an error. Freud used a word, rather a beautiful word in German, Trieb, to describe the urge, the driving force that makes demands on the mind to do stuff. And this can only mean drive. And in fact, in English biology, that's what it's called. It's called a drive. Freud also used another word, instinct, which clearly is the German equivalent of the English word instinct, and Strachey translated that as instinct. Problem is, Strachey translated Trieb as instinct too. So here there's a double problem. The first is that when you read Strachey's term instinct, you don't know, is Freud saying Trieb here, or is he saying instinct here? And the second problem is they don't mean the same thing. I've told you what a drive is, this urge, this push, this demand to do something, something like hunger or thirst, or, this is a drive. An instinct is a response to that demand. It's a stereotyped motor, it's a stereotyped behavior, like if I have this push to do something, then I have this ready-made, stereotyped instinctual behavior that's very likely to satisfy that particular drive. So it's actually two different things that Freud is talking about, and Strachey translates them both with a word which denotes only one of those things, and which really does massively distort what a trieb is. A trieb is not an instinct. So that I changed. Other things are matters of controversy. Well, with reference to Bruno Bettelheim, the title of his book was Freud and Man's Soul, and what that alludes to is the fact that the German word Seele can be translated either as soul or as mind. In fact, it really is closer to soul as a word. Etymologically, it's the same thing as soul. But Freud, for the most part, when he's writing about the Seele, he's writing about what we think of, what we call in English, the mind. In English, the soul is a metaphysical thing which we hope lives on after our death. That's not what Freud was writing about, for the most part. So where Freud is speaking about that metaphysical thing, I've used the word soul, but otherwise, following Strachey, I've used the word mind. And I'll tell you something else that I've done in cases like this in a moment. There are other words which are frankly untranslatable, like Nachträglichkeit, which means afterwardness, in other words, which doesn't have an English equivalent, which Strachey is pilloried for having translated as deferred action. So let me tell you, in fact, it's not true that Strachey translated this word as deferred action. He sometimes translated it as deferred action, but he translated it as all sorts of things, depending on the context. So what do you do in cases like this? Well, what I've done is, I think something is lost if you use a whole lot of different English words for one German word. And it's a very important concept in Freud's work. In fact, interestingly, it was only while Strachey was translating the standard edition that Lacan and others in France pointed out that this is a very important technical concept. It wasn't really considered a technical term until Lacan's seizing upon it. And so Strachey didn't have one technical equivalent of it. And I think that's a problem because it's lost. We don't know when Freud's speaking about Nachträglichkeit in the standard edition. So what I've done is whenever Freud uses a word which in any way might be related to that concept, I've put the German in square brackets afterwards. So the reader here reading about something that happens subsequently, nachträglich, I've put it in brackets so you know, this is that concept. And here, where it happens belatedly in Strachey's translation, again, I put the German word in square brackets so you can see this is the same concept. This insertion of German words in square brackets, I've done quite a lot. There's a problem with that because it's intrusive. You don't want to keep on having these German words popping up when you're reading English. But I don't think it's such a bad thing to be reminded every now and then, this guy wasn't actually writing in English. This is German. This is being rendered in English. And so it serves that purpose. What it also gives me opportunity to do is to put these superscript capital T's, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, a little superscript capital T. And what that tells the reader is this term, in this case, it's transference. This term is a translation of this German technical equivalent. And go to volume 24, there you will find a lengthy discussion of the translation of the term. So rather than change the technical terminology into a questionably better, I think highly questionably better alternative, rather keep the vocabulary that we're used to, except in cases where there's an error, put the German equivalent in square brackets. So the first time this technical term appears in each paper, I put this little T there, and that means go to volume 24 and you can read about what the German word actually means, what is lost in translation, what other renditions have been suggested for this word, what other ways was it translated by translators of Freud before Strachey, Because, by the way, Strachey was a schoolboy when Freud first started getting translated into English. So there were many predecessors. By the time Strachey came along, there was already a history of how Freud was translated into English. And what I also put into those discussions of the technical terms are what I mentioned briefly earlier, how this term has been translated in other disciplines. As I said, terms like Besetzung and Ich and so on are not invented by Freud. And so the reader is informed about the controversies rather than me imposing one new version onto them, or in fact imposing the old version onto them. At least the reader is made aware of what the controversy is all about. There are places where the term that's used in the text is not identical because they're cognate versions of each term. So I put the technical term in the margin in those cases. And so it starts to look a little bit Talmudic, I'm afraid. And there's also these things here, which is the pagination of the old standard edition in square brackets, because there's a vast literature in psychoanalysis, which is all reference to the standard edition. And now we're going to have a different standard edition with different pagination. So if you want to find the old quotations in the place that they were previously, you use that. Here are, as I told you, in volume 24, I have notes on these technical terms. So here's a very short one on those terms. Here's a slightly longer one on Abwehr, which is defense, which has been controversial, whether it should be translated as defense or fending off or warding off or et cetera, et cetera. So there's a long discussion of that. Here's the entry on Nachträglichkeit, and that's just to show you what they look like. What I've also done in other instances is superscript little t's, lowercase t's, and this is where there's controversy about the translation, not of a technical term, but of a particular passage or a particular title of a particular work, and so on. So I'm referring here to things like Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, which is translated as civilization and its discontents. It's questionable whether Kultur is civilization, and it's questionable whether Unbehagen is discontent. And so the reader is made aware of that, that this is what the German word means. These are English equivalents. These are the people who've criticized it, and so on. Since I mentioned Lacan earlier, and I know we have some Lacanians in the audience, another example of this kind is wo es war, soll ich werden, where id was, there shall ego be. Lacan was very exercised about the way that Strachey translated this sentence. So these are the kinds of things that I then discuss in these annotations to individual translations. And so, each one of these instances, I say, so-and-so said it should be like this, so-and-so, this is an alternative way in which this could be done, and so on. So that's what I did with Strachey's translations, okay? I updated them. I also updated them in the sense of modernizing them, like Strachey used the word psycho-analysis. So I dropped the hyphen. Strachey even had -day. I dropped that hyphen also and just said today. So I've tried to make it more accessible without modernizing it in a way that would be historically inappropriate. But words like today and psychoanalysis, actually in German, it's not conventional to use hyphens. It's one of the very nice things about the language. You can just bang words together, like ungeschehen machen and so on. Making unhappened is a word in German. So, but it's not only a matter of translating, of updating Strachey's translations. I've also added a whole lot of new translations of my own. And in light of the time, I'm not going to discuss any of these with you. I just want to show you, here's a listing of them. So there's 3 new works in volume 2. There's, depending how you count them, either 2 or 4 new works in volume 2. I say depending how you count them, because these are 3 little things which all relate to a single case. In volume 3, there's 5 new ones. So here it goes on. You see, I'm not going to, I wish I could discuss these all with you. They're all very, the reason I've included them is because they're very interesting and they were overlooked by Strachey. Here's volume 8, volume 9. This is a humorous little thing about contraception, more children. Every sperm is sacred. Volume 13, very interesting paper there. Here, a massively important paper, one of the missing metapsychological papers. This here, let's see what else there is here. Yeah, a draft of the ego and the id, that was great. Yeah, and this, I can't resist saying something about this, because we're in America. Freud was of the view that you don't need to be a doctor to be a psychoanalyst. And the Americans didn't like this. The American Psychoanalytic Association didn't like this. And Freud didn't like the fact that they didn't like this. And so when the question of lay analysis, which is where Freud writes this defense of non-medical analysts, when it was published in English translation in America, he ranted about the Americans. And the two advisors to Freud at the time, one was Jones, and I can't remember who the other one was, but two high-ups in the International Psychoanalytical Association said to Freud, I don't think it's a good idea to say all these nasty things about the Americans. So they persuaded him to edit it out. And Jones tells us in his biography that he advised Freud to edit out these 3 offensive sentences. So I went and had a look at the original manuscript to see what these 3 offending sentences were, and it turns out there were 6 paragraphs. And Jones called them 3 sentences, and it is a rant. I mean, you just cannot believe it. Freud didn't like, I'm sorry to tell you, America. And all these other things, here's another thing of special interest to Americans, is that there was a book published in the 50s, in the 60s. It was a psychobiography of your former president, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. And it's a psychobiography, as I said, but it was published under 2 names, Freud and Bullitt. William Bullitt had been ambassador to Vienna, to Austria, American ambassador, and that's where he got to know Freud. Later on, he was ambassador to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and in fact, he played a big part in helping get the Freud family out of Vienna in 1938. But in any event, when this book by Freud and Bullitt appeared in the 60s about Wilson, there was a great controversy about it because Freud's daughter said, this is not my father. He didn't write this. And other eminent analysts agreed. There was a review of the book by Erik Erikson. He said, this is not Freud. Well, problem is, in Yale University's library, deposited upon his death by his daughter, were Bullitt's papers, and there is the manuscript in Freud's handwriting of the first 2 chapters of the book. So there's no question but that this was Freud because it was in his handwriting. So I have chosen to include that in the Revised Standard Edition. That's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Wilson was a devout Christian, and in discussing Wilson, Freud also discusses the psychology of Christianity, and it's the most substantial comment that Freud makes anywhere on the psychology of Christianity. So why did Anna Freud and Erik Erikson say this is not Freud? Well, it's because Wilson changed it. I'm not Wilson. Bullitt. Bullitt changed it a lot. Bullitt was a fundamentalist Christian, so he thought, I better leave out things like castration anxiety and unconscious homosexuality and just about half of what Freud said. Bullitt thought is better left out. So this is why his daughter thought, this is not my father. I've given you the unadulterated version. I promised not to go into all of this, so I mustn't. But that's all the new work. There's a lot. Then I've also updated the editorial apparatus. So let me just say a little bit about that. You remember, I told you the standard edition came out in the 50s and the 60s, and there's been a hell of a lot of Freud scholarship since the 1960s. So the editorial introductions, which are really masterly, and the editorial footnotes and cross-referencing, that's Strachey provided, it really is rather out of date. So a big part of my job was updating the editorial introductions. So here is just an example, and you see underlined, I hope you can see, yeah, you can. What's underlined is everything that's new. And this, I also was in two minds about, whether I should do this or not, because it's a little intrusive, again, to have this underlining. But the view was that it's at least in the first few printings of the Revised Standard Edition, it's good to let the reader know, where this edition has been updated. And also, I don't want to make it look as if Strachey's saying something when in fact it's me saying it. So I've identified everything that I've changed by underlining it like this. Here's an example of the editor's introduction to the Project for a Scientific Psychology, and you can see quite a lot of underlining. And I put that particular page up in order to make this point that, remember, Strachey was accused of falsely scientizing Freud. As I corrected Strachey's translations, one of the things I realized was a problem with them, ironically, is that Strachey had no scientific education. This guy who was supposed to have falsely scientized Freud was a literary man. He really had no science. And so in papers like the Project for a Scientific Psychology, he got a lot wrong because he just didn't understand what he was writing about. And the same applies, I would submit, in the case of Trieb. I mean, no biologist would translate Trieb as instinct. But Strachey did, because he wasn't a biologist. That just shows you that in the editorial updating, I've also made cross-references to Freud's neuroscientific works, which is this other edition that's not about to, but it's still about 2 years away, going to come out. So that gives you a sense of how I've updated the editorial apparatus. I'll come back to an aspect of that in a moment, because when I said there's been a lot of Freud scholarship in the interim, a very interesting part of this is research into Freud's patients. We have these disguised accounts by Freud of these people who were real people. And so a lot of work has been done into what lies behind the disguising. Who were these people really? And what did Freud change in his case reports? All of that needed updating too. And I'll come back to that, as I say, in a moment. I'm nearing the end. The Freud bibliography, I've also updated. Now, you might think it odd that the Freud bibliography needs updating. Freud's dead. How can he still be publishing? Well, he's publishing a lot. Every year, there's a whole lot of new stuff of Freud's that's published. Most significantly, of course, all of his correspondences that have been published in the German and published in English translation and indeed in translations into many languages. So the Freud bibliography at the end of the standard edition is the official listing of Freud's complete published works. And the current version ends in 1974. So, Freud, there's a lot of Freud that has been published since 74 that I needed to add. But it's not only that a lot of unpublished material has been published since Freud's death. It's also that Strachey, the person who falsely scientized Freud, he overlooked a hell of a lot of Freud's scientific publications, the pre-psychoanalytical ones. I mean, Strachey left out over 200 neuroscientific titles of Freud's because he didn't even know they existed. So here is this almost comical fact. The standard edition, the old one, listed 368 entries, of which 310 were published during Freud's lifetime, whereas the new revised standard edition lists 1,736 entries, of which double the amount that were in the previous standard edition Freud bibliography were published during Freud's lifetime. So, this is a really substantial editorial updating of the official listing of Freud's works. As I said, I'm heading toward the end. So just a few other things before I do so. Offensive terminology. Now, Freud's accused of everything under the sun, as you know. He's accused of being homophobic, of being misogynistic, of being, well, everything. And most of that, I think, is highly misleading. And in fact, a lot of the new material that I've included in the revised standard edition are things that Freud published on homosexuality, on women's rights, on contraception, on, etc., things that weren't in the original standard edition, which I think show how progressive and enlightened Freud was for his time. But, there are ways in which Freud even taking account of the fact that this is more than 100 years later, that he does sound offensive. He uses terms like invert and pervert. Perversion in those days included oral sex. But more troubling, there are places where Freud is clearly a bit racist and a bit classist. He speaks about savages and primitive peoples and, this sort of thing. So what does the translator do here? There's a great temptation to sort of sanitize it. And you can't. Sadly, there are some embarrassing things that Freud said, and the job of the translator is not to improve it, it's to render it into English. So all that I've done there is apologize to the reader and said, I know this sounds offensive, sorry. But a particularly vexing question, I told you about the updating of the scholarship, and I told you that a lot of scholarship has been done, a lot of research has been done into the actual identities and lives of Freud's patients. And I wanted to include all of this because it's really interesting, to go behind the disguise and to find, oh, the person who abused her wasn't her uncle, it was her father, and she didn't only have 3 children, she had 14 children, but, 11 of them died, and, things like this. So, like, really consequential things, that we're able to inform the modern reader of. But in this research into Freud's patients, the people who did this research named the patients. So Freud gave them pseudonyms, disguised names. In this new research, their actual identities are divulged. So I faced a real problem here because, it's just felt wrong to name the patients, even though they already are, outed, as it were. I don't think in the authorized translation of Freud's complete psychological works, you should divulge the name of his patients. And the reasoning that I used was thinking of my own case. If I was going into analysis for the first time and I had to face the question, is my confidentiality going to be protected? And I would be given the assurance, yes, certainly it will be, unless your analyst becomes really famous, in which case, all of the stuff that you tell your analyst is going to be published and linked with your name for eternity. And I thought, under those conditions, I would rather not have an analysis, thank you. So it was on that basis, even if it looks a little priggish, I decided in the authorized translation, we shouldn't have the patients' names. I've also replaced most of the illustrations in the standard edition. As much as you can see, I'm quite an admirer of the original standard edition. I think the illustrations were what you say in America, crappy. Here's an example of one of the new illustrations, which goes into the psychopathology of everyday life, where Freud describes parapraxis. This was the first time Freud ever wrote about a parapraxis. This appears in one of his letters to his fiancée, Martha. While he was writing the letter, he made this splotch of ink. And then he made a circle around it and commented that perhaps the fact that the pen did this at this point means something. And bloody right it does, because what Freud was writing about to Martha at the time was pathological jealousies that he had about her. What were you doing with that guy? You know, et cetera, et cetera. And then the pen went ballistic. So that's Freud's first ever comment on a parapraxis. And this is another illustration I couldn't resist showing you. This is one of the many, many, many letters that Freud wrote to Fliess. This is the envelope. Not to put too fine a point on it, the address basically says, this is to Mr. Fliess in Berlin. It somehow gets there. New indexes, I've completely revised the indexes. That was another weak point in the old standard edition. And I have to say, I mean, I know I must stop, but I want to just say to this audience, please, you've no idea what an enormous job it is to index each and every volume of the revised standard edition and then have a composite index of all the indexes in the 24th volume. It's an enormous piece of work, and nobody knows and nobody cares. You know, the only time you notice anything about an index is when you want to look up a word and it's not in the bloody index, you know. So you only get blamed for things that are missing, and nobody knows how much. So I will end. In the dedication to the original standard edition by Strachey went like this: to the thoughts and words of Sigmund Freud, this their blurred reflection is dedicated by its contriver. And here is my dedication in the revised standard edition. It reads, and to the noble contrivances of James Strachey, this still imperfect reflection is dedicated by his successor. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and thank you for the index. Thanks a lot, but it is hard to imagine. And thank you for the roadmap through this project. It seems so enormous and daunting, and you gave us a way to approach it, and a few little stories to whet our appetites, and to go look at that new material, which seems quite exciting. And one of the things that struck me is that the arguments that I hear coming up from undergraduates in different ways is learning in their classes, oh, Freud was all wrong. Right. You know, and I think it was just too easy to do that. And I think that's not going to be as easy as this material is more part of general knowledge. So at this point, we want to open up the discussion to the audience. So I'll point to you, and if you could please say your name, the microphone. Peter's going to bring the microphone around.
Pam Cooper White. I am selfishly hoping that this will get digitized and put on PepWeb, because when we finally got the standard edition on PepWeb, it was such a boon. And is that in the works? Do you know?
Yes. So before I say anything of a commercial nature, let me make a disclaimer. I don't know exactly what my royalty is. The publisher is here. She might know, but I think it's something like 0.01% or something like that. So please know that anything that I say about the commercial side of it has nothing to do with me. I'm not making any money out of this. The publishers, quite rightly, I mean, that's an enormous investment by them to produce an edition like this. And it's beautiful, by the way. It's beautiful. I mean, the paper, printing and binding, beautiful books. And, you know, it's an enormous, they spared no expense in doing it properly. So, you know, of course, they need to recoup their investment. And so it can't go straight onto PepWeb, because then, you know, who's going to buy it? Currently, it's available in electronic editions, but not on PepWeb. Also, it's only available in 24-volume sets, and also it's only available in hardcover. And all of this is, first and foremost, you know, because very few publishers would publish anything like this these days. You know, so there has to be a return to them. There will eventually be a paperback version, and it will eventually be possible to buy individual volumes. All of that, you know, is coming down the line. And it will eventually appear on PepWeb. And so the reason why it should eventually appear on PepWeb is because the publishers don't only want to recoup their investment, they also understand that it's important that Freud is accessible. And so that is, how people, most people in our field at least, when they read Freud, when they read anything in psychoanalysis, they look to PepWeb. So it will eventually be there, but not immediately. Same as with the journals, they don't immediately come out on PepWeb. There's a delay. There'll be a delay a little bit more than the 2 years that we normally have for the journals. Thanks.
Yes.
Saul Rosenberg. Mark, could you comment on the translation of the economic point of view in metapsychology and relate that to Freud's neuroscientific works and relate that to your collaboration with Carl Friston regarding psychic energy and free energy?
Gladly.
It's a really fascinating development in neuroscience.
Yeah, gladly. I mean, that's so the actual translation from the German into the English, economisch and economic, it's the same. It's obvious. There's no mystery in the translation of the term, but the concept refers to something that really mattered a great deal to Freud, which was, in fact, when I spoke about what a drive is, Freud's definition of a drive was a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work by virtue of the connection between the mind and the body. And that measure refers to the economic point of view. It's economic in the sense that it's quantitative. It has to do with numbers. But it wasn't possible. Freud also sort of slightly embarrassedly says that there is this energy at work in the mind. And by the way, for those of you who are embarrassed by this idea of a psychical energy, Freud, remember, was a scientist wanting to bring the mind into science. And nothing, energy in physics just means capacity to do work. Nothing can happen in nature unless there's an energy behind it. So Freud, being an Englishman of science with wide education, he knows this, that, if you're going to have a science of the mind, there must be something driving the mind. There must be some energetic force behind it. And he spoke of this drive energy. That's the economic point of view. Now, in modern neuroscience, there's been obviously the same principle applies, that we have to have an energetics of the mind and the brain. And what Saul's referring to is the latest development in computational neuroscience, in theoretical neurobiology, is a thing called the free energy principle, where there's a quantity called free energy, which is basically the same thing as Freud's drive energy. And interestingly, Freud's way of understanding drive energy goes back to the thermodynamics of Helmholtz, and so does Friston's, so that it goes back to the same German intellectual and scientific roots. And Friston freely concedes that his free energy is the modern equivalent of Freud's concept of drive energy. Now, I say I'm very glad you asked that question, because it gives me the opportunity to say this. I had to restrain myself. In editing Freud's complete works, mustn't cast the works or the editorial apparatus, in the kind of interpretation of Freud that I personally hold. It's dear to my heart to bring Freud into the 21st century via neuroscience, updating Freud's concepts by translating them not linguistically but scientifically into their modern equivalents, so that we can bring psychoanalysis into modern mental science and modern neuroscience. But it wouldn't be correct for me to do all of that in the Revised Standard Edition. And incidentally, Strachey too had to restrain himself. Strachey was rather a Kleinian. I don't know if that comes as a surprise to people, but he was very keen on Melanie Klein. And you barely see a whiff of Klein in his editorial apparatus in the original Standard Edition. And I had to restrain myself in the same way. I didn't give neuroscientific interpretations in the editorial apparatus, except where it was strictly necessary, strictly relevant, like in the project, for example. And that's why, thank God, I'm not only a Freud scholar and a translator, I'm also a scientist, and I'm able to do all of that other stuff in the place where it is appropriate, which is in the scientific journals, not in Freud's collected works. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Liat Suman. Thank you. This was fascinating and what an extraordinary undertaking. I'm curious, a more kind of technical question, if you worked on it chronologically and whether something has changed in the relationship to Freud and his work as a result of this 30 years of, delving into his work.
Gosh, they're such nice questions. Yes, thank you for asking. I remember, in this great city, I used to come here monthly. And what I did when I came, I came on the first weekend of every month. And on the Friday night of those weekends, I had an appointment with Kurt Eisler, who was, the last remaining member of that original Viennese group. I used to, I'll tell you a little anecdote because we've got time. It was strange, he had this cavernous apartment on Central Park West, and it was always dark. And he had this kind of disconcerting habit of sort of looking through me and looking over me. And I only realized much later that he was blind, And it didn't matter to him whether the lights were on or not, and he wasn't really seeing me. And so we'd have this cognac together, and we would tell stories. And then exactly after 50 minutes, remember he's blind, he's not looking at his watch. Exactly after 50 minutes, he stood up, and our appointment was over. And why I'm telling you that in relation to your question is that I was sort of listening for echoes of Freud. I wanted to sort of, it was as close as I was going to get to meeting Freud was having these wonderful conversations with Kurt Eisler. And he told me so many fantastic stories. I'm going to answer your question in a second. One of them was, I said to him, psychoanalysis in America has really changed, hasn't it? And he thought, being Eisler, that I meant it was going to the dogs. So he said, oh, Dr. Solms, I said the same thing to my analyst after the Second World War. I said, psychoanalysis is going to the dogs. And my analyst said to me, really, Dr. Eisler, you think so? I said that to Professor Freud after the First World War. And I said, Professor Freud, psychoanalysis can't possibly survive after this. It's going to the dogs. And he said, so you see, Dr. Solms, what you're telling me, every generation of analysts tells this to the previous generation. The only difference is this time you're right. He also told me this, I don't know if I've got it exactly right, but this joke, something like, in der Vergangenheit sogar die Zukunft war besser. In the olden days, even the future was better. But so I was telling you about this, me trying to meet Freud, through Eisler. And really doing this translation, that's as close as I'm going to ever get to meeting Freud, because the translator's task is to take each sentence and to ask yourself, what is the idea entombed in these words? What is the man actually thinking here? What is he trying to say? What is he trying to convey, so that you can, so that you can translate the German words into English ones? And so the great reward for this 30 years of slog is being that I really understand Freud. I really, I'm sorry to say, I believe it. I understand Freud better than anyone. And it's really felt like, I've had conversations with Freud, of course, in my imagination, but it's as close as you can get, to really getting to know the guy. And I recommend him to you. Thank you.
My name is Michael Vanoy Adams. Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. Given your special interest in dreams, I'm curious about any revisions to the interpretation of dreams.
I don't know how it's happening. Each and every question that I'm being asked, I just think, thank God for that question, because it gives me an opportunity to tell you something that I would like to tell you. I told you that I had to restrain myself in terms of the updating of the editorial apparatus, not to turn it into Freud according to Mark Solms. It has to be Freud. And when it comes to the interpretation of dreams, I've spent years of my life studying brain mechanisms of dreaming. And in fact, it was one of the main reasons I became interested in psychoanalysis. So in the 1980s, mid-1980s, I started a project in which I was trying, most of our work on identifying the brain mechanism of dreaming were done in cats, first of all, and then rats. And spot the mistake. Cats and rats can't report their dreams. So what we found the brain mechanisms of REM sleep, which are so tightly correlated with dreams. If you wake people up from REM sleep, 90% chance of getting a dream report. Wake them up from non-REM sleep, it's about a 10% chance. So we thought REM sleep and dreaming are the same thing for that reason, because they're so tightly correlated. And then we identified the brain mechanisms by studying rats and cats, because you can cut bits away and see what happens. You can't do that to humans. But as I said, the downside is you don't know anything about their dreams. So I did eventually study humans. And I didn't, I hasten to add, cut away bits of their brains. So it was a long, I seem to make a habit of doing long, slow things. It was a long, slow study because I had to wait for naturally occurring lesions in sufficiently large numbers of patients so that I could group them together, like these 10 have lesions in the same area, these 10 have lesions. And I studied 365 patients. And the great shock of that study was that human beings who have damage in the part of the brain that produces REM sleep, they also lose REM sleep like rats and cats do, but they still dream. And the part of the brain which, when damaged, leads to loss of dreaming, which incidentally, REM sleep persists when dreaming stops. The main part of the brain in question here is what is generally referred to as the brain's reward system. Jaak Panksepp called it the seeking system. Kent Berridge calls it the wanting system. It's the brain's desire system. It's exactly the part of the brain that Freud would have said, this is the part that drives dreams, if Freud had only known about, the existence of this part of the brain. So that was really a whopper. It was like, wow. Dreams are not generated by the same mechanisms as generate REM sleep. And the mechanisms that do generate dreams are the very ones that Freud would have thought generate dreams. And so, as I said, that was one of the main reasons I became interested in psychoanalysis. I was so shocked by that finding. So I'm telling you all of that as a prelude to the following. So when I was updating the editorial introduction to the interpretation, I told you Strachey had a superego. It was called Ernest Jones. I had a superego. It was called Ilse Grubrich-Zemitis. And so every time I did something, I sent it to Ilse, and said, is this okay, Ilse? And I did that with my updated introduction to the interpretation of dreams. And she said, but where's the bit about the neuroscience? I mean, this... shortly, at the time that Strachey published the interpretation of dreams in English translation, it was almost immediately after that was when REM sleep was discovered and correlated with dreams. And surely Strachey would have commented on this. And I said, really, you think so, Ms. Strachey? She said, look, Mark, really, you have to have a section called the historical fate after the interpretation of dreams, what became of Freud's theory. So I'm telling you, and please spread the word, that section where I've added a whole section on the historical fate of Freud's dream theory in contemporary science. I didn't do it gratuitously myself. Ilse asked me to. Thank you. No. Ilse told me to.
We have one question from the Zoom chat by Ash. Mark, thank you for your beautiful, meticulous work on Freud's writings. What would you say was your favorite experience when it came to undertaking the translation?
I'm also glad to have the question, but it's a hard question to answer. I could say it depends on the scale at which the question is asked. In a sense, my favorite thing was what I said in response to you about getting to know Freud. That was my favorite thing about it, was I really, really, really understood. There are things I understood. If I can just give you one example, and I'm really just giving you one example, things like fundamental things that I never understood before. I hope that some of you are, or many of you, or most of you are surprised. Freud had a widened conception of sexuality, as you all know. Freud didn't just mean, copulation. By sexuality, Freud didn't even mean things you do with your genitals. Freud had a much wider conception of it. And so, he included all sorts of things, like swinging on a swing is sexual. Eating chocolate is sexual, sucking your mother's nipple when you're a baby, even when you're not hungry, is sexual, according to Freud. So what exactly, what is not sexual? And this is the question that many people ask. In Freud's conception of sexuality, where does it end? And if it's not defined by, genital stuff, then what is it defined by? And so I realized that upon reading this and translating this work, sort of dawned on me gradually, like, oh my God, Freud, now I know what he meant by sexual. What he meant by sexual is anything that is pleasurable for its own sake. Anything that is, that you're doing it for the sake of the pleasure, that makes it sexual. And everything else is not sexual. In other words, things that are not done for purposes of gaining pleasure. So like what? Like, for example, eating. Isn't eating pleasurable? Freud said, no, in itself, it's not pleasurable. It's only when it gets libidinized. And that word, Anlehnung, he said that the sexual drive, the libidinal drive, leans upon the self-preservative drive and renders it pleasurable, which is why we do things like eat when we're not hungry. Why we eat chocolate, why we suck on the nipple when we're not hungry, and so on. It's because it's pleasurable. So that's Freud's definition of the sexual. It's really important. So I've had another opportunity to say something, because of the question. There's not really answering the question, but in the broader sense, that was the if you'll forgive the pun, the most pleasurable part, was really getting to understand this guy. And he's worth understanding. But I can then narrow it down in all sorts of ways and say things like, that translating the bullet, the Woodrow Wilson stuff, and was fantastic. Translating the stuff that Freud, where I really felt this is important. People need to know this. Like, and I'll just quickly tell you. There's a thing called the Rundbriefe, which was basically like emails, in before the emails existed. The committee, Freud's committee, they would write letters upon letters in like an email string, and everyone would send it on to the next person, and so everybody would see it was like an ongoing kind of like circular correspondence. And in one of these circulars, Jones, who was then president of the IPA, said, I've been asked by the Dutch Psychoanalytical Society if they may admit a homosexual psychiatrist into the training. And surely, we should make what did he say? We should make it a general maxim, and we should announce it to all the psychoanalytical societies, a general maxim that we don't train homosexuals. And Freud said, what? To Jones, and Jones said, well, it's, what do you mean? And Freud said, well, this is, we don't discriminate against homosexuals. Homosexuality is not a disorder. It's, what are you talking about? And if we were to not accept into the training homosexual psychiatrists, it would be a kind of legal persecution of them. And Jones then, I'm not a friend of Jones. Jones, the schmarmy Jones, says, oh, of course, we know that, but the public, think about it from the point of view of the public. The public thinks that homosexuality is an abhorrent crime, and it would be very bad for our public image if we were to train homosexuals. And Freud basically said, if you'll excuse me translating it into French, Freud basically said, fuck the public. And please note what happened. So that was Freud's. Freud said we must interview each applicant on their merits, nothing to do with their sexual orientation. And that's not what happened after Freud's death. So, being able to bring these sorts of things to light, that's another bit of it which I really enjoyed. I could say many, many other things, but I'll stop.
Thank you. That's a great story. We have time for one more question.
Hi,
Oh,
my name is Grant Brenner. Thanks for speaking about your
tremendous work, and also for making a Monty Python joke, for those of you who caught it. I've had the pleasure of interviewing both you and Carl Kristen on our podcast, Doorknob Comments. And I'm deeply curious about how you think about artificial intelligence and brain network theory and how that could tie in with Freud's works. And incidentally, I think it would be very exciting to load your translation into an AI avatar and we could talk with Freud. The publisher might be interested, but if you could comment on brain network theory, AI, and how you see that through the lens of your relationship, Freud, I'd be grateful.
Thank you. Because in this audience are many psychoanalysts and psychoanalytical types who are not in the AI world. I need to translate something that Grant Brenner just said when he said, I should download the Revised Standard Edition into a chatbot. There's a thing called a grief bot. Have you heard about them?
Yes.
Yeah. It's really creepy.
Yeah.
That you can download all the information about your dead loved one, and then you have a chatbot version of him or her that you can carry on relating to. Because, everything that there is to know about your deceased loved one is downloaded into this AI agent that then has an ongoing, and I say ongoing relationship with you because it then includes everything that's happened in your conversations after their death. And so in this way, you never have to mourn, which Freud wrote a book about this, about pathological failures to mourn. So that's what Grant Brenner is referring to. It's a kind of a joke that we can make a chatbot Freud and have a genuine relationship with him. But the more serious part of his question, all the questions this evening I've really enjoyed, but that last one, I'm very sorry you asked that question, because as much as I think I've won the hearts and minds of good proportion of the audience, I'm now about to lose them in answering your question, because they're going to think I'm a nutcase. But here's the truth. This is what I think. Freud tried to bring the mind into science. That's what Freud was trying to do. There is this thing, this part of reality that Freud called psychical reality. Subjective experience exists. It's part of nature. It must therefore be brought into science. And that's what psychoanalysis was all about. Now, if subjective experience, in other words, consciousness, is part of nature, then it must be made out of the same sort of stuff as the rest of nature. There must have been a time before consciousness evolved. There must have been a time before life evolved in the universe. There was eons of time when there was no life, let alone no consciousness. And life evolved out of that non-living inorganic matter. And out of the organic matter of life evolved this thing called consciousness. It must be made of the same stuff as the rest of the universe. If that is so, then it must be possible to engineer a mind. If we truly, and I think let this be a test of how far we are from truly having a natural science of the mind. By mind, I don't mean behavior, I don't mean cognition, I mean subjective experience. That's what Freud meant by mind, the lived life of the mind, the being of the brain, the subjective aspect of mental life. And if this is going to be brought into science, it must be possible, if we truly understand the physical basis of mind, then it must be possible to engineer it. In other words, to engineer an artificial consciousness. And until we can do that, we have not truly understood scientifically how the mind works. There was a great physicist, Richard Feynman, when he died, written on his blackboard, and therefore sort of like his last words, written was, if I can't create it, I don't understand it. And so you asked me to speak about artificial consciousness in relation to Freud. That's what I would say, that if Freud's great ambition of having a natural science of the mind is going to be fulfilled, then it should be possible one day to engineer truly a mind, not just a chatbot, not just a ChatGPT, which most certainly is not conscious. Thank you very much.
all for attending. This fascinating evening and discussion, and there's more to come. Lots of work for us to do. And thank you.